they foolishly invited a journalist into this session, which you're not supposed to do. The Vatican's very clear about that. Don't do that. So she went back to her office and was going to write up the case, and literally all hell broke loose. All sorts of awful things happened to her and in her surroundings because she wasn't ready for it, and she shouldn't have been in the room.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome, everyone, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we're pleased to have Monsignor Stephen Rossetti on the podcast. Monsignor Rossetti is a Catholic exorcist, research associate professor at the Catholic University of America, and a licensed psychologist. His most recent book, Diary of an American Exorcist, can be found on Amazon, and I recommend anyone who's interested in the subject or learning more to pick it up. It's a really good book. Welcome, Monsignor. Thank you so much for coming on.
Scott, I'm glad to be with you.
I read, too, that you are a graduate of the Air Force Academy and that you were an Air Force intelligence officer. Is that correct?
That's right. I graduated from the United States Air Force Academy in 1973 and spent 6 years in the Air Force and then I went to the seminary.
Can you give me a little rundown how that worked from you going from the Air Force to your current situation now?
Well, actually, there are a number of vocations that come from the military. It's not that uncommon that you're just trading uniforms and you're used to a life of discipline and service. Instead of serving one's country, you serve the Lord. And so there's a lot of similarities, and some of our best priests have come from the military. So it's a good place to kind of prepare. As one old priest told me, he says, the service academy is kind of like the old seminary without God, although we believe in God, of course,
yeah.
but the same sort of rigor and training is similar.
Yeah. Now, I was reading through your book. I know one of the first things you mentioned, as a seminarian, you were attacked, and that was kind of your introduction to this field. Now, did someone approach you to become an exorcist? Was it something you kind of researched on your own? How did that kind of evolve?
Well, first of all, to be an exorcist, you really are chosen by the bishop.
Okay.
And you really can't be an exorcist in our church without being a priest, of course, and typically an older priest. Usually they pick older guys, and the bishop gives you his faculties. The way it happened, I've been doing this for about 15 years now. The way it happened to me was the diocese called me. They had a potential case. And as a licensed psychologist, they wanted me to do the eval. So say, is this person psychologically, distressed, or is it might be a spiritual problem? So I did the eval, and I said, didn't look psychological. I think you're going to need to call an exorcist. And the diocese asked 3 different priests to do the exorcism. They all said no. So I'm sitting there with the auxiliary bishop saying, what do we do now? I said, well, what the heck? I said, give it to me. How hard can it be? So kind of stupid, but anyway, so that was a long time ago. And I've been doing them ever since. No one else would do it.
Okay. Is it something that you find that people even within the church don't believe, or are they kind of timid or afraid to get involved with something like that? Like where do you see the spectrum in the church?
Yes, to all those things.
Okay.
Especially my generation, there was less sort of belief or interest in this sort of thing. It's rising among the younger clergy, for example, the younger priests and younger people in general. The whole generation are more attuned to the presence of evil in the world for a variety of reasons. So I think my older generation, they either didn't believe it, or they were afraid of it, or they didn't really understand it and were not trained. And so what we're seeing now is a resurgence of awareness, training, and competence, frankly, in dealing with the issue.
Now, I noticed there were a lot of reports, and maybe it started a few years ago, you probably know better than I, where it said Rome is starting to train more exorcists and getting that kind of revamped. Now, is that to counter something they saw within society, evil rising, reports rising?
Well, it's an interesting question. Is it worse today with terms of Satan versus the past? Well, first of all, Satan's always been around. I mean, if you actually talk to people, even post-Vatican II, when people didn't talk about it much, but privately, people would tell you that they had problems. So Satan's never gone away. He didn't take a vacation. Mm-hmm. But today, I think people are more willing to speak about it. Is our situations worse today? That's hard to answer that. But I would say, as our practicing of the faith, the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, decreases, And as more people do more and more what we call occult stuff, witchcraft and Ouija boards and all that sort of thing, the more you do that and the less you practice your faith, the more problems you're going to have. And right now in America, for example, more people are practicing witchcraft. When I grew up, no one did pray. It wasn't even discussed, and now like it's kind of like I'm a witch, or all the tarot cards, all that kind of stuff. That's an invitation. You do that and you're opening yourself up to problems.
And I noticed in the book you reference people, I believe, I might not get the term right. Is it gifted people or people who are able to see spiritual things, demons, angels?
Yeah.
Now, when you talk about gifts, and a lot of stuff is attributed to if you practice the occult, and like a demon may give you certain things to keep you kind of hooked on what they're doing with you.
Yeah, we wouldn't call that a gift, by the way. That would be a curse, frankly. But,
yeah. How do you differentiate between like when someone is truly gifted and has something from God? How do you start when they start noticing they have that ability? How do you start weeding out between, is this something demonic messing with me, or is it actually a gift from God?
Well, no, it's interesting, Scott, that you're asking, because as you know, I have a weekly blog and called the Exorcist Diary, and we have 42,000 subscribers, so we have a great following and people seeing it, and I share experiences. And this week's one I'm working on right now is a common thing where someone comes up to me and says, I'm aware of evil when it's in present and when demons, that sort of thing. Am I possessed or am I spiritual sensitive? What am I? And so that's a real discernment. I mean, some people who are possessed recognize other possessed people, but some people have a special gift. For example, St. Catherine of Siena, famous mystic, famous female saint, great exorcist. Because of her holiness, she saw demons and she cast them out. Padre Pio, another great mystic. So it was not uncommon that great mystics and saints saw demons and through the power of Christ in them cast them out.
And how many people, I guess, in your team or around you have that ability? Is it something that's...
Well, we don't start counting faces. I mean, but we
Sure.
do have people and different kinds of charisms. But we screen them very carefully because a lot of people say, I see demons, and they're just frankly just crazy, or it's in their head. And a lot of people like that. It's in their head. But we're screening. Well, we do have people who very much are gifted, and we screen them carefully and train them, and they're an important part of our ministry. Because one of the problems when someone comes to you and says, "I've got demons," well, do they? I mean, many of them, if not most of them, don't. It's just in their head, but some of them do, and our spiritual sensitives can help us discern that.
And it's a rare thing, though. Like it's not common for you to come across.
I would say different levels are rare. Some who actually see them, I know very, very few of those.
Okay.
But for those who sense the presence of evil, there are more of them. So actually, the theologian would suggest that before the fall of Adam and Eve, in our pure state, if you will, before original sin, we all had that. We all were communing with the angels. And so we all had that preternatural gift in it because that was part of who we are as spiritual people. But with the fall, it has marred, if you will, our spiritual capacities and crippled them in some ways. And so we lost most of that. But some people retain vestiges of them. And so that's what we're looking for, is people who have vestiges of these original spiritual giftedness. And so I think there's actually more of it than people would realize.
Interesting. And how do they describe, because you always see the classic image of an angel with wings, or you see a demon described as ugly. How are these people who are able to kind of talk about this and see these things, how do they describe angels and demons? Well,
very interesting. First of all, of course, angels and demons are fallen angels, don't have bodies. They're purely spiritual beings. So they don't have a body per se. But angels are beautiful as they live in the presence of God. And demons are incredibly evil and incredibly ugly. As one person who was a great mystic said, the images you see on television of demons and evil is not even close. It's a comic book compared to how awful evil is. So Saint Faustina, famous Polish nun mystic, said that one of the seven sufferings of hell is the vision of Satan. She said, if you actually had a direct vision of Satan, she said, you would rather suffer all the sufferings of the world for eternity than one quick glimpse of how horrible Satan is. So we underestimate the real horror of sin and evil. It's just incredibly awful.
Now, going through the cases in your book, it was, I mean, people would obviously read it. Some will believe it. Some won't. Even say in the beginning, like, this has happened. Nothing's exaggerated. Believe it or not. There's a couple cases that stuck out to me, though. One was you referred to him as Jason in the book. And you actually go back to it a few different times through the diary entries. Mm-hmm. His case seemed quite shocking, really. I mean, all the stuff that was happening to him. Can you describe that case a little bit, and then how is he doing now?
Well, I do, as you implied, disguise cases and change genders and change all sorts of things so you can't tell who it is. Mm-hmm. And many of them are composites. For example, you have many cases which are very, so that's one thing that is interesting, which confirms our ministry, is that you keep seeing the same things again and again and again and again. People don't know each other, and they're doing the same sorts of things because demons are the same. Or when we sit down with other exorcists, we've never spoken to each other before. We compare notes and find out that our experiences are very similar. So I would say those cases that you see in the book, Diary of American Exorcist, are very real. I mean, as I said, I changed. I not exaggerated nothing. All I did was, it's a diary. I shared my own experiences. That's all I did. I mean, I know some people don't believe it, but the problem is that do you really believe the truth about God and the truth about Satan? Mm-hmm. And it's hard for people to believe that someone would be that evil, but Satan is that evil, and not to be trifled with.
One of the interesting things you say, and I've heard this from another exorcist that we interviewed, was if priests or exorcists enter into that battle without making sure their life is in order, or maybe clearing themselves through confession first, have you seen instances, and can you talk about anything, even if you're kind of protecting people's privacy, where a priest approached something and wasn't ready and it had it turn on them? And what typically happens in that?
Yeah, no, there's no question about it, that not just priests, but laity too, which is why we're very careful about who is in the room. For example, a case, not but another exorcist, they foolishly invited a journalist into this session, which you're not supposed to do. The Vatican's very clear about that. Don't do that. So anyway, this woman came in. She was a journalist, and she went through the exorcism with the group. And so she went back to her, office, and was going to write up the case, and literally all hell broke loose. I mean, all sorts of awful things happened to her and in her surroundings because she wasn't ready for it, and she shouldn't have been in the room. And we've got one case right now where there's a severely possessed person, and people were kind of going to her orbit trying to help her, and you have all sorts of, and they get attacked themselves because they're not ready to be in the presence of that much evil. So we trust in Jesus, of course, and we live a holy life. But if you're not, you don't have that shield and protection, which is why I tell people they if they have problems or are frightened, they said, listen, practice of faith. For Catholics, we go to confession, we go to Mass, we go to Eucharist, and live a holy life. Jesus will protect you. But if you don't be too surprised. And what happens to you?
And what are the limits of what can happen to you? I know you say demons can't kill you, but I mean, you get some people who are driven into suicide. You get people who are abused physically with scratch marks. I mean, where are the limits here in the rules?
I talked to a guy yesterday working with. He's been scratched. So they're clearly demonic scratches. He's got there are 3 scratches. I mean, they typically go in 3s, scratch, and they only show up, strange times and burned little triangles on his body. We've had people burned upside down crosses. So Satan he tries to frighten you people, but God won't let Satan directly kill you. He won't, can't, never has. With us, he can try to get you to commit suicide, if you mentioned. And I'm convinced that more than a few people commit suicide, do so because Satan's, jabbing in their ear and pushing them. Mm-hmm. But in the end, it's your own choice. So I would say Satan's on a tight leash. God allows him to tempt us, and sometimes if you're possessed, he can actually torture people. But I've never seen him maim anyone. No permanent injuries. No, as I always say, I'm going to give you a heart attack. No, he's not. I'm going to get you you're going to have cancer. No, you might think you do, but you don't. All the cases we've had, they have these faux illnesses, but there's a real limit of what God allows Satan to do.
And what for you, is there a particular case that's most unsettling? And is it something that, I know when you have, a strong faith and a belief in Jesus and that it can't harm you in the end, but is there something that has stuck with you over the many years you've done this and the many cases you've encountered?
Stuck with lots of things stick with me,
I don't want to use the word unnerved because when we talk to other exorcists, it's not like, I don't think it's the same as like me walking into a room and seeing this and being like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming and fearful.
People do get unnerved by by the presence of evil. For example, sometimes, people say, they often say, the picture flew off the wall and they say, oh my gosh, what should we do? I say, well, put it back. And the idea is that, Satan tries to manipulate people by frightening them. And fear of Satan gives him more control. We've got several people who are not liberated because they're too frightened of Satan. You've got to trust in Jesus. Satan is a dust bunny compared to Jesus. He's nothing. But he tries to frighten people. And I would say he's a thug. He tries to frighten people. And that's why it's so important to have a strong faith. He said, don't let him bug you too much. It's a famous saint. I think it was John Vianney or St. Catherine, one of them. They were in bed one night and the bed starts shaking and all sorts of stuff. And, he or she looks up and he goes, oh, he sees the demon, he says, only you, and goes back to sleep. That's the right response. Really? It's only you. And also, is that the best he can do? Shake my bed a little bit and throw crucifixes around? That's what a 9-year-old would do. Basically they act like a bunch of 9-year-olds. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to fight you. And they throw little antics. We call them demonic antics,
And now, have you been personally attacked and has anything?
Of course. If you're an exorcist, you seriously do cases and you have a lot of them, you're going to enter the fray. But God takes care of us. He's, it's a great grace actually to be in this ministry that the Lord gives you great grace. Your God is generous. He's not going to let you be overwhelmed or be less generous. If you enter the fray, God is just generous. If you give him a nickel, he'll give you $1,000 back. Every time you give God a little nickel, he's going to shower with you with riches. So you can't outdo God in generosity.
Can someone be possessed and you not know it? Because I know a lot of people don't or seem to have a reaction when the religious objects come into the picture or they try to go to their house of worship. And could someone have a problem and just maybe not be a churchgoer, and so you never encounter that?
Yeah, I do think so. For example, when someone comes in and says they've got problems, I ask 2 questions in my own head first. Why you and why now? In other words, why you? How did you get these demons? How'd you get them? And then 2, why now? See, people can have a demonic presence and not know it, but then sometimes they'll convert to the Catholic faith. They'll go through the RCIA program to join the faith. They'll become the seminary to become priests, or to join the convent to become sisters. And the demons don't like it. All of a sudden they say, wait a minute, you belong to me. And they say, you can't become a priest, you can't become a nun, you can't become a Catholic, whatever. So they go berserk. And then you had those demons, and now they're kicking up. Mm-hmm. So they can be kind of quiet, and as long as you're living a nice, good secular or evil life, they're pretty happy.
Regarding all the occult stuff and kind of like you said, it's kind of on the uptick in terms of magic and like good witches and all this other kind of stuff. Now I have to confess, I have used a Ouija board. Oh, actually, it wasn't a Ouija board. It was like a chalk, and you turn it upside down, and it was like right. And I did it with some friends a while ago, before we got into the subject, and I started realizing how kind of unwise that would be. And I knew everybody there with their fingers on it, and the thing started moving in a way that kind of was insane. It was creating circles over and over again. It was getting more and more aggressive. And the person who was leading it was like, "Oh, it's so and so, reaching out to you." After the fact, we were like, I would never do that again. Um, is there an element of subconscious at work there where it can be like just a phenomena of a game, or is it always something that's is it working, right? Because you have a majority of the population think that a Ouija board is a game that you buy in a store and there's nothing supernatural about it. How do you come down on that with what you've seen?
Are you familiar with the movie The Exorcist in
Yes.
the 1970s? Yeah, everybody is. It's based on a true case. And by the way, you can buy the notes, the Jesuit who did the exorcism in a book. I think it's called The Exorcist Diary, which is a similar title to my book. But basically it's based on a real case. A 12-year-old boy, who actually wasn't a boy, it was a boy, not a girl. And he got possessed. He really was possessed. You read the notes, you can tell that the kid was possessed for sure. And how he got possessed was using a Ouija board for months. So you use a Ouija board once or twice, maybe, who knows what'll happen, but you keep doing it. You keep inviting in some unnamed spiritual forces, and eventually, you keep giving Satan an invitation. Pretty soon, he's going to take you up on it. Mm. So while there's no doubt that a lot of psychological stuff can happen in Ouija boards, but also, a spiritual thing can happen, and we have cases where they have, and it gets pretty ugly.
Would the Ouija board kind of be the top of the list in terms of those kind of things? I mean, minus, more about the casual use.
All of them, Charlie, tarot cards, basically what all these things, or even Reiki, for example, when you invite in unnamed spiritual forces. And you might even want to say, well, I'm inviting in the spirit of the earth. There's no spirit of the earth. I mean, you're inviting, what are you getting? Or I'm inviting some ancient druid forces. I mean, I hear this all the time. Or the power of the feminine and the witchcraft. Or basically, any of this sort of unnamed spiritual forces, you're not sure what you're going to get. Mm-hmm. If you ain't asking for God, then you're not quite sure what you're going to get. And sometimes be unhappy about what you did get. So any of these sorts of things, we call them divinations, and basically it's an invitation, an open invitation that the evil one may take you up on.
And now you go over a few names in the book regarding some of the higher ranking demons, and it was interesting to hear about the hierarchy you talked about, and also the fact that they abuse each other. And obviously, I think you mentioned in the book you come across Satan. Was it once or twice in your time doing this? And how does that different from the other ones?
Well, angels live in a hierarchy, a very strict hierarchy. The angels in heaven do. And it's, but they're all united in love. So it's not like a lockstep military organization. Although they're shown with swords and spears, but they're really the swords and spears of Christ, the truth of Jesus. But demons retain their rank when they fall, of course, because that's the way they're made. And so Lucifer is the top of the food chain, and then there's got a bunch of lieutenants, Beelzebub and Lilith and all these lieutenants in hell. Baal, there's a whole bunch of them who are his lieutenants, and then you go all the way down the chain into the smaller demons and the minor ones you never heard of. And they're probably they're untold number, billions, probably, maybe more, trillions, who knows, of fallen angels. So yeah, they retain their rank. And when we encounter a possessed person, there's someone's in charge. Typically, there's going to be a senior demon or higher ranking demon who is leading the pack. And unfortunately, if you get one of the bigger ones, like Beelzebub or someone like that, or Baal, you're in for a bigger fight. It's going to be more difficult to cast out one of these major lieutenants of hell. The Jesus does, of course, but it's a bit more of a fight.
Yeah, some of the length of those things seems pretty daunting, especially probably for the person going through it when you have to kind of weed out many. Now, did you ever see a pattern to when these higher ranking ones would be involved with someone? Was it attributed to what they were doing, or was it?
Yeah, the worse sins, the worse you sin, the worse the sin that got you possessed, the more power the demons have.
Okay.
So I found that, for example, some people have demons and it's not their fault. I mean, we've had people come in and their parents were witches or whatever, or into Santeria or all those sorts of, or voodoo or whatever.
Mhm.
And so their kids grew up with this in the family, and then they become adults, they renounce it, but because of their parents, their family's involvement, they have some demonic stuff themselves. So they come in and we pray over them, and typically you'll get rid of them a lot faster because they're really not culpable. They didn't do it themselves.
I see.
But when a person practices divination, for example, when they're someone like, for example, I've got one woman who practiced witchcraft for about 10 years. That's going to take a long time to get rid of those demons. She did this. She practiced witchcraft, and those spirits of divination are dug in, and it's going to be a fight. It's going to take a few years to get rid of them.
Yeah, there's this conception I've seen online when we posted some of the other clips from The Exorcist that people were like, no, it doesn't take years. It's quick. All you have to do is invoke Jesus and it's gone. And then, I don't know, is that ignorance? Is it, what is
Yeah, it's ignorance. I mean, basically, we do this as part of our ministry day in and day out. And sometimes they are cast out quickly. But I wish it was that easy.
Yeah.
We have lots of kids. It can go anywhere from a couple sessions to we had one that took 5 years. She's doing fine now, but that she came from a family that performed abortions. It's a horrible crime, regardless of what people think. And but she didn't do it, but her family wasn't. She was severely possessed. It took 5 years to get rid of them.
So would it be fair to say that angel appearance, because you said, they don't have bodies. It's such a funny thing that you just automatically think, oh, they have bodies. But would it be fair to say that they manifest to the person for the purpose of acceptance or for them to kind of not be freaked out? Well, in a demon's case, they want you to be afraid. But in an angel case, they're going to come maybe to a form that you find appealing.
Typically, when the mystics talk about their visions of angels and demons, the angels look like they're beautiful. Sometimes they don't have wings, but sometimes they do appear with wings, but they don't really have wings. It's a sign of their fleetness and speed of the angel. But yeah, they appear in a form that the human person can understand. And demons, of course, are always incredibly ugly, deformed, blacker than black, and often like deformed beasts. The beasts that they are, these naked, deformed beasts.
The description of the use of the snake eyes and the pinpoint pupils, and I guess that kind of leads into the psychology aspect of it. When you're differentiating between these two things, and could it be, I think there's a term with DID that's thrown around a lot now. I'm sure some of those symptoms like that doesn't occur with any kind of psychological illness.
Well, obviously, as a licensed psychologist, it's very helpful for me because I do know the difference between schizophrenia, DID, dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorders, and sort of psychosis and possession. And sometimes in the beginning, there's a lot of people, for example, who are paranoid schizophrenics, sadly, who believe they're possessed. And they'll have this sort of voice in their head which tells them to do evil things and says evil things, but they're not possessed. It's just a paranoid schizophrenia. A DID, dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorders, that's very different than a real possession case. And you start working with them enough, and you'll see the difference between them. Not the same thing, of course.
So you don't see any kind of like those scratch marks you're talking about, the voice changes. Where is that line for you where you're like, hey, this is no longer in the realm of mental illness?
It's a multiple, discernment's a multiple level interaction with the person. But I do have a sense of when someone really is psychotic and it doesn't feel the same, it doesn't look the same as a DID, So I get a lot of people who come to me with psychosis, but they're not possessed. I pray a little prayer for healing for them and tell them to see your psychiatrist, take your medications, and I feel very bad for them because they're horrible diseases, but it's not demons.
And when I originally emailed you, I'd mentioned that I wanted to talk about suffering with you a little bit and belief in God and how my father passed away and the difficulty in the anger I have toward that. And for you, how are you as a man of faith melt those two together? A loving God, suffering, sometimes, and I'm not talking about like, personal choices that kind of put you in a bad spot, but like natural disasters, kids with diseases. Like, how do you make this sense in your head? And for people like me who kind of struggle with it.
Yeah, well, I would say that's probably the number one challenge of the faith. Is people say There's so much evil in the world. Why does God allow this? So there's no question about that. That's a personal challenge for all of us in the faith. And of course, in Christianity, we come up with some basic guidelines. We say God is good. God did not create evil. God created us. That's the whole story of Adam and Eve. God created us to be good and did not create evil. Satan, Lucifer, whatever, was created good. He chose to reject God and chose evil. Adam and Eve chose to reject God and commit sin. So the result of those choices that God honors, he gives us free will because, frankly, you can't love truly without having free will. Otherwise, you're kind of slaves, I mean, your gerbil can't love the way you can. You have free will. But with that free will comes an incredible freedom and responsibility. And the evil in this world that's here, that we all suffer, is a result of human beings and angels falling and committing sin. Now, you say, well, why doesn't God do something about it? He did. He sent Jesus. And the death of Jesus, his death and resurrection, saved us. Does it stop us from suffering? No. Does he understand suffering? Yeah, he went through it. If we suffer in faith, he will make that suffering a source of grace and our own sanctification. So why does God allow demons to beat up Padre Pio? Well, he was a great saint. And St. John Vianney, for example, when the demons would beat him up at night, he would say, the demons were tough. The grippin, he called them the grippin. The grippin was, beat me up last night. And I know, he said, that great sinners are coming tomorrow for confession. Great graces will be given because through my own modest little sufferings, which are allied with those of Jesus on the cross, can be salvific. So God takes evil and makes it a source of grace. And that's what makes demons nuts. Basically, the more they do their evil things, the more ultimately it redounds to the wisdom and the glory and the kingdom of God.
Well said. What should people do if they're afraid?
Well, there's also a sort of natural fear. But if you're there at night at 3 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden something goes thump and your picture flows off the wall, or you get shoved down the stairs, which I've been, and you get a little nervous by that. Basically, say a little prayer. I sleep with my rosary beads, and I ask our Blessed Mother to protect me. She does. So whenever we are a little bit frightened, we can be, of course, we're human beings. We just say a prayer and ask the Lord and Jesus to protect us.
Do you have a particular prayer that you find most useful in those situations?
People ask me that all the time. Say, Father, I got the situation. I want the prayer that's going to work. Well, I mean, yeah. Well, I understand. I mean, we do have specific kinds of prayers, but we got to be careful not to be involved in magic. That's magic. See, if I say the right prayer, this will solve my problem. No, I just look to the Lord and say, Lord, I need some help here, And I would say prayer from the heart. I mean, yeah, we can use those rote prayers, which are good. The Our Father, the Hail Mary, the St. Michael prayer. But in the end, it's an affair of the heart. Lord, help, help.
Before I let you go here, biggest thing someone can do who's struggling with their faith or who hasn't given up on it, right? But they're still bogged down by like the suffering aspect and different things going on, to not fall into that, I think, a vicious cycle of kind of despair and kind of like emptiness. Do you find there's a path, right? Keep seeking, keep pushing, and you'll come out of that darkness? Or how do you look at that?
Yeah, well, I would say regular daily prayer would be key. I would say regular daily prayer would be key. And living a good life, stop sinning. I mean, when you commit sins, you tie yourself to the dark kingdom. Number 2. And I would say, for Catholics, go to Mass, go to confession, go to communion. In other words, fortify yourself. Do those things which promote the faith. And sometimes I've got this little prayer I like to say at night. Lord, I choose to believe. I choose to trust you. I choose to love you. I might not feel like it right now, but ultimately these are choices. They're not emotions. That's a mistake Americans make. They're big into emotions, but emotions are come and go and come and go. No. I choose to believe. I choose to trust God. and I choose to love God.
That's good. And lastly, past loved ones, when people are like, oh, someone passed away and you're looking for signs or things are happening in the house. Is that possible? Or is it, demonic? Do you feel threatened? Do you feel safe? Will you know the difference?
Well, the church doesn't really say anything about spirits that are not demons. We do believe in demons, of course, obviously. But can people, loved ones, contact us? If God allows it, of course. I mean, and saints have been contacted by souls in purgatory or whatever. Well, so whatever God allows can take place. Now, I think many times people say I've got ghosts and they really got demons. So you got to be careful about that. Many ghost sightings are not really ghosts, but they're demons. However, can my loved ones contact me beyond the grave if God allows it? Do we do mediums? And some of them, absolutely not. Then you open yourself up to God knows what. Mm-hmm. But I know more than a few people who believe a departed loved one, gave them a little sign. And I personally believe that God sometimes allows this.
So if it's increasing in like aggressiveness or getting worse or hanging around too long, that's a sign like, hey, I should go get some spiritual help.
Yeah, no, anytime these things become aggressive, negative, or whatever, that's probably a demon. And what usually happens, the situation is that it starts by being nice. Mm-hmm. I'm really a friendly ghost. I'm Casper, the friendly ghost. They think that, and so isn't this cute? We call him Marvin or whatever. Marvin's our friendly family ghost. And Marvin seemed like a pretty decent chap here for a few months until you got a nice little cozy relation with Marvin. And all of a sudden, Marvin starts turning ugly. You say, oh, Marvin might not be a ghost. Marvin might be a demon.
Do they get focused on kids? Will they try to go after the children and kind of like befriend like their imaginary friend? Is there anything parents should be like, hey, what's that about?
As long as you need an open line of communication with the kids as best you can. You want the kids to tell you what's going on in their lives. That's going to be key. As a psychologist, you want the family to communicate. Mm-hmm. And when they start having these paranormal experiences, then you ought to, take note and do some discernment.
Last question for you, because you're in the Air Force intelligence. UFOs. What do you think about all this happening?
UFOs.
And what's your opinion on, the Senate's taking it a little more serious, and how does the church view UFOs? My mother believed in UFOs. Okay. But I don't. But she did. And the church is it's kind of open to whatever. I think it was John Paul II said, or I forgot which pope it was. He said that you can believe in aliens if you want, and if there are aliens, we'll preach them to Jesus, talk about Jesus to them and salvation. So, could there be life on other planets? Who knows? The church doesn't say yes or no. You're free to believe what you want. I personally don't. My mother did, so you can side with her. You can side with me. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time. If anybody wants to find out more about you or the newsletter or your blog, where can they go? www.catholicexorcism.org. CatholicExorcism.org. We have a website. We have an app. We have a monthly online deliverance session. So once a month, we pray over the whole group of people. And typically, last session, we had 9,000 people sign up and show up eventually. So it's very popular. The Lord is generous and casts out those demons. So I suggest you, if you want to be prayed over for healing, join us in our online deliverance session, CatholicExorcism.org. Again, the book is Diary of an American Exorcist. You can see it. I got another camera up there. It's a little better than this one here. Check it out, you guys. And thank you so much, Monsignor. I really appreciate it. You're welcome, Scott. God bless you.